Hi, my name is Melissa Chawla, and this is my presentation on curation and COVID-19, digitizing in a post-pandemic world. During this presentation, I'll be talking about the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the field of digital curation. First, I will offer a brief introduction about the pandemic. Then, I'll go into some of the issues brought on by the quarantine shift to remote work. Next, I'll talk about some of the things digital archivists have had to consider when planning to work from home. After that, I will be going over 3 case studies detailing how different archives have handled the shift to remote work, the sorts of strategies they've employed, and the projects they've undertaken. Following that, I will talk a little more about some of the positive impacts remote work has had on the field. I will then conclude with some takeaways from the presentation. Now, March of 2020 was generally when the quarantine officially began in the US. Stay-at-home orders swept through the country, and non-essential workers were predominantly told one of 2 things. Either they were out of work completely, which for some was temporary, while for others it was more permanent, or they were working from home. In many cases, archivists fit into this non-essential category. For those who kept working or else regained employment later on, the new professional climate brought on its own set of issues. With patrons unable to visit the archives in person, there was an increased need for digitized content. This only added onto the backlogs already in place, which are materials received by repositories awaiting processing. Even worse, the lack of in-person equipment access caused complete halts in many digitization projects. On the more administrative side of things, remote work meant that there was inevitably going to be an increased amount of virtual work being produced and stored. The metadata from this work is called digital exhaust, and when the data is consolidated and analyzed over time, it becomes known as a digital footprint. Now, for institutions looking to keep continued archival records, this becomes yet another backlog problem, being that the amount of digital exhaust produced has increased exponentially. Finally, another major issue that's come about from this increased virtual climate is security. When the quarantine began, everything had to be adapted very quickly, and efforts to transition to remote workflows, like adding new software, hardware, or infrastructure, was sometimes done hastily. There were less thorough configuration controls and security checks, and an increased usage in exploitable VPNs and cloud-based technologies. Even more worryingly, hackers were aware of this and always looking to take advantage of increased technology usage. There was an uptick in phishing schemes and malware campaigns on popular products, especially those connecting remote workers. Efforts to combat these risks are varied, and 2 predominant methods include simply offering security awareness training and also increased vulnerability scanning. Now, in spite of these issues, archivists looking to flourish in their new circumstances had to focus on some of the more concrete ways they might handle remote work. Some major goals they had in this endeavor include the need to improve and promote continued access to materials, the need to provide continued work to archive staff, and the desire to maintain a sense of continued community and participation amongst researchers and patrons. Some of the roadblocks standing in the way of these goals included technology issues and access for staff at home, alongside other at-home complications. There were scenarios, for example, where maybe someone didn't have access to a computer, or a staff member with a child might have had to juggle work with homeschooling. With this in mind, let's take a look at the first case study, seeing how staff in the Brooklyn College Archives and Special Collections handled things. In order to promote continued work for staff, some of the things they did included retrieving materials from the university for continued work from home and planning to move scanning equipment to staff homes with IT assistance. Meanwhile, the actual work undergone by the archives remotely ended up consisting of a lot of long-desired projects that had previously been low priority. Most predominantly, they were finally able to increase their number of available finding aids in an updated format. Previously, many of their finding aids were located in outdated PDF formats, and at this time, they finally had the opportunity to upgrade to EAD, or encoded archival description, using an Excel template. In addition to this, they created a searchable document describing each collection, outsourced the digitization of microfilmed student newspapers, and performed in-house metadata creation on the newspapers, and uploaded the materials to their collections, to their college's digital platform. They also digitized and transcribed oral history interviews, which had previously been inaccessible without a playback machine. The Brooklyn College Archives and Special Collections is a case where there were a lot of backlogs and outdated systems in need of updating. By comparison, Seton Hall was an archive that had a lot of digitized content already in place. Instead of ingest, their priority was then largely to increase virtual engagement in their content. They did this through things like online tours, a virtual Easter egg hunt, and a major mapping project of all their digitized content. This was particularly challenging due to a lack of access to much of their metadata. Now, alongside these efforts, Seton Hall also spent this time post-pandemic by reevaluating some of their older practices. Upon the realization that a significant amount of their content was not yet housed in archive space and Preservica, they enacted a survey to gain a better idea of exactly how much still needed to be transferred. In addition to this, plans began to develop to shift their digitization practices from something less need-based into something a little bit more regimented and scheduled. This brings us to the last case study, focusing on Georgetown University Law Library's pandemic experience. One major project their digital initiatives, or DI department, began working on during this time was the digitization of microfilm records and briefs from the District of Columbia Circuit Court of Appeals. Microfilm has an interesting place in remote digitization because it's a format which, without digitization, can only be viewed in person with specific machinery. Because of this, it was a priority for many repositories during this time. The Digital Initiatives project was made doubly challenging because of the inability to gather information in person. Since a lot of the information was only recorded on in-person machinery, much of the new metadata also had to be recorded from scratch. Despite this, the project was largely a success. To date, DI has digitized some 1,300 rolls of microfilm DC circuit court records, representing roughly 14,000 cases. 400 of these rolls, spanning between 1891 and 1956, have been made available online. Now, during the pandemic, Georgetown University Law Library also dealt with the specific challenges of remote work by redesigning many of their workflows to be conducive to it. Google Sheets was chosen as a collaborative alternative to Excel, using standard spreadsheet formulas and Python coding to interact with various APIs, moving both metadata and digital files from local storage to public access points. This method not only allows all staff members to access projects remotely and simultaneously with other staff, but also dramatically reduces time spent during data entry. It's an especially significant contribution to their archive in that the shortened work time could mean less backlog in the long term. Moving on to discuss some of the more positive impacts of remote work in digital curation, I'll be offering some examples from the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA's pandemic activities. Firstly, as suggested by all three cases, the shift to remote work has in many instances pushed archives to reevaluate their previously outdated or limited digitization schemas. The pandemic has seen with it the creation of various new workflows geared towards the remote. Another example of this took place in NARA, which found that while imaging records must be done on-site, many digitization steps like processing images, creating metadata, and performing quality control can be done remotely. Another positive change has been that many previously overlooked projects were given priority and attention. Some examples in NARA included the reduction of their backlogs for previously digitized information, additions of new digital content to NARA's online catalog, and the preparation of the 1950 census for public release in 2022. NARA manages the census with schedules on microfilm available from 1790 to 1940, and most have now been digitized by the agency's digitization partners. Finally, post-pandemic remote work has systematically facilitated the adoption of innovative technologies. In the case of NARA, machine learning and artificial intelligence tools are being looked into to promote processing and records access. Finally, there are some takeaways I'd like to touch upon. The COVID-19 pandemic and quarantine brought about a massive shift in the field of digital curation towards remote work. This resulted in problems like new backlogs created on collections and administrative levels, and increased security risks. Nonetheless, digital archivists have handled this shift by creating new remote work-friendly workflows, completing previously set-aside projects, responding to an increased need for digitized content like microfilm digitization, and promoting continued access to digital materials among patrons. Ultimately, despite the many issues that have arisen, digital archivists have come out of quarantine with deeper understandings of their institutions and the work that must be done to promote continued innovation. Thank you.